Today I am once again flying the Arado Ar-234, this time on the Operation Paravane scenario from the CombatBox multiplayer server. My mission today is to bomb the bomber airfield in the southeastern part of the map, and I'll be flying out of Sapporo, which is in the northwestern part of the map. Rather than flying straight over there and facing a ton of enemy fighters, my flight plan has me flying to Taman airfield and then turning 140 degrees to fly along the coast. Because of the prevailing winds, which are out of the south at 190 degrees, I want to approach with a perfect tailwind. So I want to approach my airfield, my target, with a heading of 10 degrees. And so as a result, my flight plan is going to take me past the target and to the east, and then I'm going to turn back around, heading 10 degrees for my bomb run. My Arado is armed with a 1,000 kilogram bomb and is equipped with the rocket boosters and the Drogue chute. Going through the startup procedures, I first pull back the yoke so that I can get a good view of the RPM gauges, and then initiate the startup sequence for engine 1. I watch carefully as the RPMs start to rise, waiting for them to reach 1000 RPM on the inner gauge, which just happens to be equal to 5000 RPM on the outer gauge. Once it gets there, I push the igniter button for engine 1 and wait for it to fire up. Once ignition has been achieved, the RPM gauge starts to move up very, very quickly. And once it switches from the inner gauge to the outer gauge, I very carefully increase the throttle, making sure not to overheat the engines until the throttle lock engages and I reach 3000 RPMs. At that point, I turn off the ignition switch for engine 1. And now I go through the same procedure for engine 2, initiating the engine 2 startup procedures and waiting for the RPM gauge to reach 1000 RPM. When it does, I push the ignition switch for engine 2 and wait for it to fire. I then watch as the RPMs rise, and when the RPM gauge switches to the outer gauge, I carefully increase the throttle, watching the exhaust temperature to make sure I don't start an engine fire. And once that engine has also reached 3000 RPM, I release the ignition on engine 2. I then set flaps to the takeoff position. Engage the toe brakes, and then carefully and gradually increase the throttle to 7000 RPM. I realize at this point that I have not yet closed my canopy, which is very important on the Ar-234 because with the canopy open, you cannot use your periscope, and the periscope includes the bomb sight. Even if the canopy is torn off, it still counts as open, and you cannot use your periscope. So closing the canopy before takeoff, very important. I close the canopy, and now I am ready to go. I double check my dive bomb sight, and at 7,000 RPM I release the toe brakes and increase the throttle to full. Once I'm lined up, I engage the rocket boosters. And now it's a race to 210 kilometers per hour. Once I reach takeoff speed, I rotate, but I'm still using the rocket boosters to help me gain altitude and gain airspeed. I retract the landing gear. And once the rocket boosters are spent, I jettison them and they parachute safely to the ground. At a safe airspeed, I retract my flaps. And then I turn toward Taman Airfield, which will be my first waypoint. Once I'm generally lined up on Taman Airfield, I engage the Autopilot and separately activate the yaw, pitch, and roll controls. I then increase my Autopilot pitch setting to 5 degrees, and this is the climb angle of attack that I will maintain all the way up to 4,000 meters of altitude. So with my pitch and heading locked in by the Autopilot, I will now fast forward until I reach Taman Airfield. With Taman Airfield down below, I use the Autopilot to adjust my yaw setting to a course of 140 degrees. Now, because I'm using the Autopilot, the change in course is very gradual, so that by the time I actually reach heading of 140, I will be very close to the coast here of this peninsula. And from that point, I will head 140 degrees to my second waypoint. At this point, my Autopilot is still set to a 5-degree climb, as I'm hoping to achieve an altitude of 4,000 meters. And while I'm making this relatively long stretch of my flight plan, I am setting up my bomb sight by setting the target altitude to 60 meters, by setting my contact altimeter to 2,000 meters, and by setting my wind speed to positive 29 to account for the 29 kilometer per hour tailwind. As I'm approaching an altitude of 4,000 meters, I get ready to adjust the yaw setting on my Autopilot down to 0. And as I reach 4,000 meters, I make the adjustment. And now that I'm no longer climbing, with yaw setting still set at 140 degrees, I should start to accelerate. The target bomber airfield is just up around that bend, just behind the cloud. But, as I noted, because I want to approach on a heading of 10 degrees, I'm going to have to go quite a ways past the target airfield before I can turn back. One big advantage to flying out over the ocean like this is that I avoid all the Allied fighter planes that are often patrolling over the city near the bomber airfield, or who are hunting for the attack planes that tend to sneak along the edge of those cliffs down there to stay out of sight. But at 4,000 meters and out here over the ocean, I've yet to encounter any resistance, although of course there's a first time for everything. I can now clearly see the target airfield off to my left, but the landmark for beginning my bomb run is actually the small bay near Gelendzhik airfield. So until such time as I'm approximately lined up with the bay at Gelendzhik, I am not ready to commence my bomb run. And this is the part of the plan that really requires patience, because this leg is so long and you can so clearly see the bomber airfield that is the target. It's so tempting to just turn toward the target and get it over with. But I'm determined to execute the plan. But after patiently waiting and resisting the temptation to turn in early toward the target, I see the Gelendzhik Bay through my side window, and I do my best to approximate when is the right time to turn to 10 degrees toward the target. I know I don't need the bay directly off my wing, so I'm going to turn just a little bit early. As I reach what I think is probably the right point, I disengage the autopilot and turn until I'm approximately lined up with the target, which I'm expecting and hoping will be a heading of about 10 degrees. I then re-engage the autopilot and switch to the dive bomb sight. At this point, I'm controlling the plane exclusively with the autopilot settings. I first adjust the yaw until I'm heading directly toward my intended target. I was hoping for a heading of 10 degrees. Turns out my actual heading is approximately 08 degrees, but that should be close enough for the tailwind not to have any appreciable effect. I then adjust my autopilot pitch settings, trying to position my target approximately 1/3 of the way down from the gun sight. And as I get closer to the target, I will continue to increase my downward pitch to try to keep the target at approximately that 1/3 position. Now, this isn't absolutely necessary, but I've found that keeping the target in that approximately 1/3 position results in me reaching the bomb point at approximately 2,000 meters of altitude, which is my goal. And it's also where I've set my contact altimeter. As the target draws closer, I continue to adjust my pitch downward. And I also make subtle adjustments to the yaw setting to actually pinpoint the placement of my bombs. I've spotted what appear to be 2 bombers sitting in the open next to a tent that likely conceals a 3rd bomber, and I've chosen that as my target. As the Pipper comes into view, I track it until it's directly over my intended target. Bombs away. A direct hit, and enemy bombers destroyed. With the bomb run complete, all that remains is to get home safely. But since I was diving the entire way into the bomb run, the Arado is now moving at very high speed, making it nearly impossible for the enemy to respond. And given that my goal now is to get out without attracting any undue attention, I increase the throttle to maximum and alter my course using the Autopilot yaw adjustment to ensure that I don't lose any unnecessary airspeed. Turning to a course of 310, I start my way back to base. Immediately after releasing the bombs, and even before leaving the bomb site, I reduced my dive to 2 degrees, which was enough to maintain a high airspeed, even when I invariably would have to cut back on throttle. Any bomber pilot familiar with Operation Paravane on CombatBox will know how dangerous this area near Olhovka airfield is, because Olhovka is almost always under attack by Allied fighters. As a result, as I'm flying through, I'm trying to keep my airspeed as high as possible. But of course, I don't have a lot of altitude left. I'm going to get to Sapporo. So invariably my airspeed is decreasing. Still, I'm moving so fast that any enemy who spots me is likely only going to get a pot shot. Fortunately, I didn't encounter any enemy resistance. As I near Sapporo, I begin gradually decreasing my throttle, but not gradually enough. And unfortunately, my number 1 engine suffers a flameout. At this point, I had plenty of altitude and plenty of airspeed to land with only 1 engine. But I made a mistake and tried to restart my engine, my number 1 engine, in midair. It restarted, but almost immediately I had to deal with an engine fire. I panicked for a moment, but then I realized I wasn't ready for this mission to end in disaster. So, calming myself, I engaged full left rudder and rolled in the opposite direction. If I was lucky, this would put out the engine fire before it was too late. And I did, in fact, get lucky. maintaining the left rudder and right bank until I was sure the engine fire was out. I now had no choice but to land on one engine. But that wasn't a problem. I had plenty of airspeed, plenty of altitude to reach the base, lower my landing gear, lower my flaps, and land safely. In fact, that's what I should have done right from the start. Approaching the runway, I reduced my airspeed until it was safe to lower my landing gear and lower flaps. Then, when I was below 300 kph, I did so, using the thrust from my one remaining engine to ensure I didn't drop below 200 kilometers per hour. At a comfortable glide speed and glide slope, I approached the runway, and when I was certain that I could make a safe landing, I lowered my flaps into the landing position. I then reduced my speed to 200 kilometers per hour and made final preparations for landing. As I reached my target point, I rolled out, touched down, deployed my Drogue chute, applied the brakes, and came safely to a stop. I then shut down my remaining engine and called it a day. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I see you on the multiplayer servers.